My name is Beatrice Collins. I am 67 years old. For most of my life, I worked as an administrative manager at a regional hospital, a quiet job, a steady job, one that taught me how to keep my voice calm even when everything around me felt urgent. The night my son erased me from his life, I was already dressed. I remember that part very clearly. I was standing in my bedroom wearing a navy blue dress I had chosen weeks before. It was hanging perfectly, freshly pressed. On my bed lay a gift wrapped in cream paper and tied with a thin silver ribbon. It was expensive. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because it was a celebration I had paid for myself. Then my phone buzzed. One message. From my son, Ethan. "Mom, don't come. My in-laws don't want you here." I read it once. Then again, I did not sit down. I did not cry. I did not reply. The party was still happening, a birthday celebration for my granddaughter, a large venue, a catered dinner, music, flowers. Every invoice had come to my email, every payment had come from my account, and yet I was no longer welcome. I stood there, still holding my phone, while the house around me stayed perfectly silent. The kind of silence that does not comfort you, but waits for your reaction. On the dresser beside me was an old silk scarf, pale green with frayed edges. I lifted it, folded it once, and placed it gently back down. That scarf had been with me longer than my son's marriage, longer than most of the roles I had played in my life. I took a slow breath. This was not the first time I had been quietly removed. It was simply the first time it had been said out loud. I imagined the room where the party was happening, the lights, the laughter. My absence explained away with a sentence I would never hear, something polite, something convenient. She understands. She's busy. She didn't mind. That sentence had followed me for decades. But that night, something inside me shifted. Not in anger, not in rage, something colder, something clearer. I did not text back. I did not call my son. Instead, I made one phone call. It lasted less than 3 minutes. My voice did not shake. I did not explain my feelings. I did not ask for fairness. I simply stated facts, dates, payments, agreements that had never been honored out loud because no one believed they ever needed to be. When I ended the call, I felt strangely calm, as if I had finally stopped leaning forward. I looked at myself in the mirror. A woman in her late 60s, calm posture, tired eyes, still standing. That was when I knew the night would not end the way they expected. If you are listening to this story, take a moment before we go further. If stories about family, silence, quiet injustice, and finding strength later in life speak to you, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. These stories are told slowly, and they are meant to be shared. Now, let me tell you why that message did not surprise me. Because long before my son told me not to come, I had already learned what it meant to disappear politely. I had spent years making myself smaller so others could feel comfortable. I had funded homes I was never invited to decorate. I had paid for celebrations where my seat was optional. I had learned how to smile through being overlooked because I believed that patience was a form of love. That night was not about a party. It was about permission. They believed I would accept the message. They believed I would stay home, fold the dress away, and understand. They were right about one thing. I did understand. I understood exactly where I stood, and for the first time in my life, I chose not to step back into the place they had assigned me. I knew that phone call would leave people stunned. After I ended that phone call, I stayed standing in my bedroom for a long time. I did not change out of the dress. I did not sit down. My body felt like it was holding a memory, not a moment. That message from Ethan had not come out of nowhere. It was only the final sentence in a story that had started decades earlier, when I was still young enough to believe that giving everything would eventually mean being seen. When I was in my 30s, my life was built around schedules, not dreams, not questions, schedules. I woke before sunrise, packed lunches, ironed shirts, and made sure the house stayed quiet enough for everyone else to feel rested. I worked full-time, but my job was always described as something extra, never essential. The real work, people said, was what I did at home. I told myself that was fine. I remember my hands the most. They were always busy, cooking, cleaning, sorting paperwork, signing permission slips, holding a pen at work all day, then holding a wooden spoon at night. The skin on my fingers grew rough and dry. I used lotion, but it never lasted. There was always something else to do. By the time I was 40, my calendar was no longer mine. It belonged to my husband's meetings, my son's school events, my mother's doctor appointments. I wrote everything down carefully, in neat handwriting, because I believed that if I stayed organized, nothing would fall apart. No one ever noticed how full those pages were. They only noticed when something was missing. Dinner was often late, not because I forgot, but because I waited. I waited for the calls to end, for traffic to clear, for moods to improve. I learned how to reheat food without complaint. Plates went back into the microwave quietly so no one would feel rushed. I told myself that patience was a skill, that love meant adjusting. There were things I wanted once, small things, a course I thought about taking, a transfer at work that would have meant longer hours but more responsibility. Each time I postponed them, there was always a reason. Ethan needed help with school. My husband was under stress. The timing was never right. I remember standing in the kitchen one night, washing dishes long after everyone had gone to bed. The house was dark except for the light above the sink. I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older than I felt and younger than I already was. I told myself it was only a season, that someday, when things settled, I would come back to myself, that someday never came on its own. In my 50s, I became even better at standing behind others. I learned how to anticipate needs before they were spoken. I paid bills without discussion. I covered shortfalls without explanation. It felt easier to handle things quietly than to ask for recognition. When Ethan became an adult, I shifted again. I told myself this was the reward phase, that now he would understand what I had done, that respect would replace responsibility. Instead, my role simply changed shape. I became the one who helped without conditions, the one who filled gaps, the one who said yes quickly, because saying no felt like failure. I convinced myself that generosity would teach gratitude. What it actually taught was expectation. There was a sentence I repeated to myself for years. I said it when I was tired. I said it when I felt overlooked. I said it when my name was missing from conversations that involved my money or my time. If I give enough, they will see me. I believed that sacrifice worked like a savings account, that one day all the deposits would be acknowledged. But foundations are not thanked. They are used. They are trusted to hold weight without being admired. No one looks at the concrete beneath their feet and feels impressed. They only notice it when it cracks. That night, standing in my dress with my phone still in my hand, the truth settled fully for the first time. I had been the foundation. Strong, quiet, necessary, and completely unseen. The truth is, I did see the signs. I just trained myself to look away. After years of being the foundation, you learn a dangerous skill. You learn how to call neglect a misunderstanding. You learn how to rename disrespect as stress. You learn how to turn a small wound into something you can live with, because the alternative feels like admitting your whole life has been built on a lie. When Ethan married Naomi, I tried to welcome her with the kind of warmth I had once wished someone would offer me. I brought casseroles, folded baby clothes, paid for little things without making a show of it. Naomi would smile and say thank you, but her eyes rarely stayed on my face. They flicked past me as if I were a checkout counter rather than a person. It was subtle at first, the way she asked questions. Not how are you doing, but are you still working, and do you have that retirement account set up, and what's your mortgage like now? She wrapped it in casual conversation, the way someone might ask about the weather. I told myself she was just trying to understand the family. I told myself that. Margaret Hale, Naomi's mother, was different. She never bothered with softness. She moved through a room like she owned it, even when she was a guest. She had a way of praising Naomi loudly while speaking to me as if I were staff. The first time I met her, she looked around my kitchen and said, "It's nice, cozy. Ethan must have learned humility from you." She laughed like it was a compliment. I forced a small smile because I did not want to start a war over a sentence. Later, at a holiday dinner, I offered to bring dessert. Margaret said, "Oh, don't worry, Beatrice, we'll handle the important things. You can just bring something simple." Simple. The word landed in my chest like a stone. Naomi laughed lightly, as if her mother had made a clever joke. Ethan glanced at me and gave me that look he had practiced since he was a teenager. The look that asked me to be easy. The look that said, "Please, Mom." After the baby was born, the pattern sharpened. They called when they needed something: a last-minute check for a deposit, help covering a medical bill, a contribution toward a better daycare. Each request came wrapped in urgency and gratitude. We hate to ask. It's just this once. You're the only one who understands. And then, as soon as the problem was solved, the calls became quiet again. Weeks would pass, sometimes months. I would send a text asking how my granddaughter was doing, and Naomi would respond hours later with a photo and 2 words. "So busy." Ethan's responses were always the same. "Sorry, Mom. Crazy week." You know how it is. And then the sentence that became a thread through my life. "Mom, please understand." He said it gently, like he was asking me to forgive him for spilling milk. "Mom, please understand," when they could not make it to my birthday dinner. "Mom, please understand," when they invited his in-laws to everything but forgot to include me. "Mom, please understand," when I found out they had taken a family trip and never told me. I would swallow the hurt and say I understood because I wanted to believe the best, because I wanted my son to feel safe with me, because I feared that if I demanded more, I would lose what little access I had. But the smallest moments were the ones that stayed. Naomi, standing beside me in a boutique, pointing at a handbag and saying, "This is the kind of thing you could gift if you really wanted to make an impression." Margaret, at a restaurant, tells the waiter, "Put it on Beatrice's tab. She likes to feel helpful." Ethan laughing awkwardly, not correcting her, then turning to me afterward and saying, "She didn't mean it like that, Mom. Please understand." Each time I felt the same question rise in me, quiet but persistent. Was forgiveness the same as love? Or had I confused love with silence? I had been taught that family meant enduring, that mothers made things go smoothly, that good. Women swallowed discomfort for the sake of peace, but peace built on one person's swallowing is not peace, it is controlled. And I was starting to realize that Naomi and Margaret did not see me as a mother or a person with limits. They saw me as a resource, a steady one, reliable, predictable, the kind of woman who would always say yes, then blame herself for wanting anything in return. Standing there that night, still in my dress, I understood something else too. The signs had not been invisible. They had been inconvenient, and I had spent years forgiving, thinking it was love, when it might have been fear. By the time the house entered the conversation, the pattern was already familiar. It arrived quietly, dressed up as practicality. Ethan called one afternoon and told me they were thinking about buying a place closer to Naomi's parents. "Better schools," he said. "More space for the baby. A good investment." I listened without interrupting, already sensing where the conversation was going. He did not ask directly. He never did. Instead, he talked about interest rates, timing, and how difficult it was for young families now. Naomi joined the call halfway through, her voice bright and purposeful. Margaret's name came up more than once, always followed by the phrase, "She thinks this is the smart move." I noticed how no one asked what I thought. They only waited for me to respond. I told them I would help. The relief on the other end of the line was immediate. Gratitude poured out in overlapping voices. Promises followed. They said this would make everything easier. They said I was giving my granddaughter stability. They said they could not have done it without me. I let those words settle where doubts should have been, because I wanted them to be true. The first time I saw the house, it was already chosen. Naomi walked through the rooms with her mother, pointing out changes she wanted to make. The kitchen would be opened up. The guest room would become an office. Margaret commented on how much value the renovations would add. I stood near the doorway, holding my purse, listening. No one asked if I liked the layout. No one asked if I had any preferences. I told myself that was reasonable. It was their home, after all. I was just helping. When paperwork day came, I was invited last. The real estate agent shook my hand politely, then focused on Ethan and Naomi. They discussed timelines and next steps as if I were not there. The documents were slid across the table toward me when it was time to sign. The language was dense. Numbers. Clauses. My name appeared where it needed to, then disappeared again. I noticed that my role was clearly defined and carefully limited. Contributor, not the owner. Support, not authority. I hesitated for a moment, pen hovering above the paper. Something in me wanted to ask a question. Something small, something reasonable. But Margaret was already checking her watch. Naomi was scrolling through her phone. Ethan gave me that look again, the one that asked for understanding before I had even objected, so I signed. I told myself that trust was more important than control, that love did not require leverage, that asking for a say would make things awkward. I had spent my life avoiding awkwardness, mistaking it for harmony. After they moved in, the house filled quickly with rules that did not include me. Shoes off at the door, visits needed to be scheduled. Certain rooms were private. Naomi once rearranged the furniture while I was there and said, "This flows better for us." I nodded and stepped aside as if I were visiting a hotel I had paid for but did not belong in. Margaret referred to it as their family home. She said it proudly, especially when others were around. "We're so proud of what they've built," she would say. I noticed how she never mentioned my name unless it was about how lucky they were to have support. Support, not sacrifice, not contribution. Support sounded lighter, easier to accept. There were moments when the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Naomi asked me to cover a repair without consulting me first. Ethan told me about a refinance after it had already happened. I learned about decisions after they were made, never before. Each time I felt a quiet heat rise in my chest, then cool just as quickly. I told myself this was normal. I told myself not to make things difficult. But humiliation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves slowly, politely. It shows up when you realize you are paying for a house where you cannot choose the paint color. It shows up when you bring groceries and are told where to put them. It shows up when you are thanked publicly but dismissed privately. I would drive home afterward and sit in my car for a few extra minutes before going inside. Not because I was tired, but because I needed a moment to remember where I was allowed to exist freely. In my own home, the silence felt different, heavier, less forgiving. I began to understand something I had avoided naming. Power does not need to be loud to be absolute. It can smile. It can say thank you. It can let you pay the bill and still leave you standing in the doorway. That house was never mine, but the cost of it was. I did not mean to hear it. That is the part I remind myself of, even now. I was not listening out of suspicion or anger. I was there because I had been invited. Naomi had asked me to come by that afternoon to watch my granddaughter while she ran errands. Ethan was working from home. The house was quiet in that careful way it always was when I visited, as if sound itself needed permission. I was in the hallway just outside the guest room they used as an office when Ethan's voice reached me. The door was not fully closed. I paused without thinking, my body reacting before my mind did. There was something in his tone I recognized. Not stress, not frustration, calculation. He was on the phone. I heard Naomi's name first, then Margaret's. The conversation moved quickly, overlapping voices, the low murmur people use when they assume privacy. I should have stepped away. I know that. But my feet stayed where they were, rooted to the floor as if the house itself were holding me still. Ethan laughed softly at something the other person said. It was not a joyful laugh. It was the sound of agreement. Then he said the sentence that split something open inside me. "She won't say no." He said it casually, confidently, like a fact that no longer needed proof. There was a pause on the line. Then he added, "She never does." I felt my chest tighten, not with shock, but with recognition. The words did not wound me because they were cruel. They wounded me because they were accurate. He went on talking, discussing logistics, timing, money, how to present it. He mentioned me again, this time as part of a solution, not a person. I heard my name used the way one might refer to a savings account or a backup plan. "She'll understand," he said. "She always understands." The door creaked slightly as he shifted his weight. I stepped back then, silently, my heart pounding in a way that felt strangely controlled. I moved into the kitchen and sat down at the table, my hands folded neatly in front of me. My granddaughter played on the floor, unaware. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Life continued, indifferent to the moment that had just passed through me. For years, I had wondered if Ethan realized what he was asking of me, if he knew the cost, if he saw the accumulation of small sacrifices as something that mattered. I had comforted myself with the idea that he was unaware, that he loved me but did not fully see me, that ignorance, at least, would mean there was no intent. That sentence removed the last place I'd been hiding. He knew. He knew that I would rearrange my life without complaint. He knew that I would absorb disappointment quietly. He knew that I would prioritize his comfort over my own boundaries. And knowing all of that, he still chose to ask, still chose to use it. I had always believed that love excused many things, but love that relies on predictability is not love. It is leverage. When Ethan came out of the office, he smiled at me, the same smile he had worn his entire life. Familiar, disarming. He asked if everything was okay. I nodded. The motion felt automatic, practiced. He thanked me again for coming. He said he appreciated me. The words slid past me without landing anywhere. As I watched him move around the kitchen, I saw him differently, not as my child, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who had learned very well what my silence could be used for. There was grief in that realization, a clean, sharp grief. Not because he had disappointed me, but because I had misread him for so long. I had confused his comfort with kindness. I had mistaken familiarity for care. I left shortly after. In the car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and breathed until my pulse slowed. I did not cry. I did not shout. I did not rehearse arguments in my head. I simply allowed the truth to exist without softening it. The truth was this. My son did not take advantage of me by accident. He did it because he knew I would let him, and for the first time I asked myself a question I had avoided my entire life. If love always requires me to disappear, then what am I protecting? That question followed me home, and it did not leave. That question followed me home. It sat with me through the evening. Through the quiet routines I had always used to calm myself. I washed a few dishes in the sink. I folded a towel that did not need folding. I checked my phone once, then set it face down on the counter as if the screen itself could bruise me. I did not call anyone. I did not tell a friend. I did not draft a long message to Ethan that would only end with me apologizing for being hurt. I simply moved through my house like a guest who had forgotten where the exits were. Later, I stood in my bathroom and turned on the light above the mirror. The woman who looked back at me did not look dramatic. She looked ordinary. A few fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Hair that used to be darker, now soft with gray. A face that had learned to hold calm even when the heart underneath it was tired. I leaned closer, not to criticize, but to study. There was something sobering about seeing myself without the roles attached. Not a mother, not a helper, not a solution, just a person. A 67-year-old woman standing alone in a quiet house, finally facing the one person she had avoided disappointing at all costs. Me. For years, whenever something hurt, I had directed my anger outward and then quickly swallowed it. Naomi was demanding, Margaret was sharp, Ethan was distracted. Everyone had a reason. Everyone had a story, and if I could explain them, I could forgive them. If I could forgive them, I could keep the family intact. That was the bargain I had made without ever signing it. But in that mirror, I realized the truth was simpler than the narratives I had built. It was not only what they did, it was what I allowed. It was what I trained them to expect. That is not a sentence people like to hear, because it sounds like blame. And for a long time, I avoided it for that reason. I did not want to be the kind of woman who turned pain into self-punishment. I did not want to excuse their behavior by claiming it was my fault. I just wanted to see the shape of the truth clearly, without emotion clouding it. So I stood there and practiced something new. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. I remembered every time I said yes when I wanted to say no. Every time I offered money when what I wanted was respect. Every time I accepted a dismissive comment because confronting it felt exhausting. I remembered how often I had mistaken being needed for being loved. My chest tightened, then loosened again as if my body were learning that honesty did not kill me. I turned the faucet on, let the water run over my hands, and watched it disappear down the drain. The sound was steady, clean. It reminded me that release could be simple. Not loud, not violent, just consistent. I looked back at myself and tried to speak to her the way I would speak to a friend. You did what you thought love required. You did what you were taught was good. You were not weak. You were loyal. But loyalty without boundaries is not virtue. It is surrender. That was the pivot, not a sudden explosion, not a dramatic decision made in one brave moment. It was slower than that. It was the gradual shift of a woman realizing she was tired of being predictable. It was the quiet recognition that my kindness had become a tool others used, and I had been handing it over like it was nothing. The strange thing was, once I stopped blaming them, I felt lighter. When you blame, you keep the other person central. You keep circling their behavior, searching for the right explanation. You stay attached to their choices. But when I stopped blaming, I also stopped chasing. I did not need to convince Naomi to be kinder. I did not need to persuade Margaret to respect me. I did not need to beg Ethan to finally see me. I needed to see myself. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and walked back into my bedroom. The navy dress still hung neatly where I had left it. The wrapped gift still rested on the bed, like a symbol of all the times I had tried to earn my place. I sat down for the first time that night, not out of defeat, but out of decision. I breathed slowly, letting the calm settle deep, and in that calm, I understood what my next step would not be. It would not be loud. It would not be cruel. It would be deliberate. It would be deliberate. That was the word that stayed with me as the night moved forward. Not impulsive, not emotional, not performative, deliberate. I had spent decades reacting to other people's needs. Now I wanted to act on my own clarity. I wanted a step that could not be argued with, a step that did not depend on anyone's mood or apology. That is why I called Daniel Wright. I had met Daniel years earlier through work. He was a legal advisor who helped our hospital navigate contracts and disputes. He was not flashy. He did not talk in dramatic threats. He asked precise questions, listened carefully, and spoke in a voice that made chaos feel smaller. We were not close friends. He was simply someone I respected, and in that moment, respect mattered more than comfort. It was late enough that I expected voicemail, but he answered on the second ring. "Beatrice," he said, steady as ever. "Is everything all right?" I looked at the old silk scarf on my dresser as if it were a witness. Then I said, "Daniel, I need your help." He did not ask me to calm down. He did not rush me. He said, "Tell me what happened." So I told him, not with tears, not with accusations, just facts. The text message, the party, the payments, the pattern. I described it the way I would have described a problem at work, because that was the only way to keep my voice from breaking into something I did not want to be. When I finished, there was a quiet pause on the line. Not judgment, not a shock, just thought. Then he asked, "What do you want to happen next?" That question should have been simple. I had wanted so many things for so long: respect, gratitude, a sincere apology. But in that moment, I realized those were not outcomes I could demand without handing them more power over me. I could not force my son to feel remorse. I could not force my daughter-in-law to treat me like family. I could not force Margaret to recognize my humanity. What I could do was remove my availability as a tool. So I said the only sentence that mattered, the sentence that had been forming in my chest for years. "Help me stop allowing this." My voice stayed calm. It was not dramatic. It was not revenge. It was a request for structure, for lawful power, for a boundary that could hold even if my emotions wavered. Daniel exhaled softly, as if he had been waiting for me to say exactly that. "All right," he said, "we can do that." He began asking questions, one at a time, careful and exact. What accounts are connected to them? What have you signed? What obligations are in writing? Do they have access to anything in your name? His questions were not meant to scare me. They were meant to map the truth. And for the first time, the truth felt like something I could organize, not something I had to endure. I answered as best as I could, where my money went, how often, what the house documents said, which payments were automatic, where my credit cards had been used. I heard myself speaking, and I realized how much I had normalized, how many details I had accepted without scrutiny because I had trusted love to be safe. Daniel said, "Beatrice, I want to be very clear. Setting boundaries is not punishment, it is protection. We will not lie. We will not manipulate. We will not do anything that puts you at risk. We will simply make sure your resources are no longer treated like community property." His language was calm, but it landed with strength. It reminded me that I did not need to become a different person to be safe. I did not need to become cruel. I only needed to become defined. He continued, "You funded the event. That means you have standing. There are ways to handle this cleanly." That word mattered. It meant no screaming scenes, no public humiliation for the sake of drama. It meant consequences that matched behavior, consequences that were legal, documented, and undeniable. I stared at the navy dress hanging in my closet. "I do not want to hurt my son," I said quietly. "I just cannot keep being used." "I understand," Daniel replied, "and that is exactly why we do this the right way." Before we ended the call, he gave me a short plan, not a scheme, a sequence. Calls to make in the morning, documents to gather, accounts to review, permissions to revoke if they existed. He told me what to write down, what to save, and what not to say yet. His tone carried calm authority, the kind that does not inflate conflict, but contains it. When I hung up, nothing in my house looked different. The scarf was still on the dresser. The gift is still on the bed. My phone is still face down on the counter. But inside me, something had shifted into place. I was not begging for respect anymore. I was building a boundary. And for the first time in years, I felt protected. For the first time in years, I felt protected, not by a person's affection, but by a plan. The next part happened without me in the room, and that was the point. I did not need to stand in front of them to prove anything. I did not need to argue my way into a seat at a table I had paid for. I only needed to stop the machine they had built around my silence. The party still went on. At the venue, lights glowed warm and soft. Music filled the corners. The staff moved quickly, trained to smile and keep everything seamless. Guests arrived carrying wrapped gifts, dressed in their best, ready to celebrate a child who had done nothing wrong. Naomi played the perfect host, the kind of woman who could laugh easily while controlling every detail. Margaret stood near the entrance like a queen receiving her court, greeting people as if she owned not only the room, but the story. Ethan was there too. He was probably checking his phone, pacing between tables, telling himself that I understood, telling himself that this was easier, that it would be fine. Then the first crack appeared. It was small at first, a whisper between staff members, a pause at the bar when someone asked for an extra bottle of wine, a quick glance toward the manager, the kind of look people exchange when something they expected to work suddenly does not, because at some point in the evening a payment was attempted, another tray of food, an overtime charge, a final vendor bill, something routine, something the venue processed automatically, and my card was declined. Not because I did not have money, not because I forgot to pay, but because permission had changed. When people rely on your quiet generosity, they do not build backup plans. They build entitlement. They assume the foundation will always hold. I was not there to see the exact moment Naomi's smile tightened, but I can imagine it. I can imagine her stepping aside with the manager, speaking in a low, urgent voice. I can imagine Margaret's face sharpening, offended not by the inconvenience, but by the audacity of being interrupted. I can imagine Ethan's stomach dropping as he realized something was different. They would have tried to fix it quickly. That is what people like. Them do. They call it a glitch. They act as if the system is at fault, not their assumptions. Naomi likely pulled out her own card with a practiced laugh, only to realize the cost was larger than she expected. Margaret likely offered her card next, not because she wanted to help, but because she could not tolerate public embarrassment. Then the second crack, because the venue manager trained to handle situations discreetly would have had one simple requirement: payment authorization, confirmation, a name attached to responsibility, and that name was mine. That is when Daniel's representative arrived, not in a dramatic entrance, not with cameras or shouting, just a calm, professional figure in a suit, carrying a folder and speaking with the quiet clarity of someone who cannot be argued into silence. Daniel had told me earlier that lawful power does not need volume, it needs documentation. The representative approached management first. That was important. No confrontation, no spectacle, just a procedure. Then, when management pointed toward the host table, the representative walked there with the same steady pace one might use in a courthouse hallway. Naomi would have stood, confused, still trying to smile. Ethan would have gone pale. Margaret would have bristled. Ready to demand respect, the representative would have said my name out loud. Beatrice Collins has instructed our office to clarify payment and authorization for this event. Not a threat, not an insult, a clarification, a boundary made audible. The folder would have opened. Papers would have been shown, not to humiliate but to establish control. The venue did not care about family dynamics, it cared about liability. It cared about who had the right to approve charges and who did not. In that moment, my absence became present, because suddenly, everyone in that room understood something they had refused to acknowledge. The party they were hosting was not theirs in the way they had pretended. The comfort they had assumed was built on my eyes, and my yes was no longer automatic. Naomi would have tried to speak. Margaret would have tried to dominate the conversation. Ethan would have tried to smooth it over, to do what he always did, to make things feel normal again. But you cannot negotiate with a boundary that has been documented. That is the power reversal, not revenge, not humiliation for sport, just the clean removal of access. A system reset. While they stood there scrambling for control, I was at home, in silence, in my own kitchen, breathing steadily, knowing that for the first time they were the ones forced to adapt. And the night did not end the way they expected. While the party unraveled without me, my phone began to vibrate on the kitchen counter. At first, I did not look at it. I was standing by the sink, watching steam rise from a mug of tea I had poured but not yet touched. The house was quiet, in the way only an evening can be when nothing is expected of you. The phone vibrated again. I knew who it was before I ever saw the screen. Panic has a rhythm. Urgency has a tone. Even without sound, I could feel it pressing toward me, demanding attention the way it always had. I picked up the phone and turned it face up. Ethan's name, then Naomi's, then Ethan again. The calls came close together, as if speed could undo what had already happened. I watched them appear and disappear one after another, the screen lighting up my kitchen like a pulse. I did not answer. I did not send a message explaining myself. I did not type and delete words the way I used to, searching for the least disruptive sentence. I set the phone back down. There was a time when that would have felt impossible. Silence had always scared me. Silence meant disapproval. Silence meant distance. Silence meant I might be misunderstood. For years I had rushed to fill it with reassurance, apologies, explanations that softened the discomfort of others at my own expense. But this silence felt different. This silence was chosen. The phone buzzed again. A text this time. I did not read it. I did not need to. I already knew the shape of the message. Confusion. Accusation disguised as concern. An appeal to reason that ignored the reason I had finally claimed. I moved to the living room and sat down slowly, my movements deliberate. The chair held my weight without complaint. I noticed small things I usually rushed past: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock, the way my shoulders dropped when no one was watching. The calls continued. I imagined them at the venue, voices raised just enough to be heard but not enough to cause a scene. I imagined Ethan trying to negotiate his way back into familiarity. I imagined Naomi pacing, furious at the loss of control. I imagined Margaret demanding answers, offended that anyone would dare interrupt a story she believed she was entitled to tell. For the first time, their reactions were not my responsibility. That realization was both freeing and frightening. When you step out of a role you have played for decades, there is a moment when the script goes silent. No cues, no lines, just space. And in that space, you must decide who you are without applause or approval. My phone buzzed again, then again. Missed calls stacked on the screen. I let them accumulate. Each vibration felt less urgent than the last, not because the situation was less serious, but because I was no longer available as an emotional emergency contact. I walked back into the bedroom and looked at the dress hanging neatly where I had left it. I touched the fabric lightly, then let my hand fall away. The night was no longer about what I wore or where I was expected to be. It was about what I was no longer willing to do. I thought about calling back, about explaining that I was not trying to ruin anything, that I loved them, that this was not personal, just necessary. The words lined up easily. In my head, practice from years of smoothing things over, and then I stopped myself. Explanations had always been my way of keeping the peace. They were also the way I taught others that my boundaries were negotiable. If I explained enough, surely they would understand. If they understood, surely they would stop. They never had. I sat on the edge of the bed and held my phone in both hands, feeling its weight. I thought about the sentence that had formed quietly inside me earlier, the one that felt like truth without decoration. I did not disappear. I simply stopped explaining. That was the difference. Silence is not absence when it is intentional. It is a presence turned inward. It is the refusal to perform your pain for someone else's comfort. It is the space where consequences are allowed to exist without being softened. Eventually, the phone stopped vibrating. Not because they understood, but because there was nothing left to press against. The boundary held. The world did not end. No one burst through my door demanding answers. The night moved on without my participation, and that was exactly the point. I placed the phone face down on the dresser and turned off the light. As I lay down, the quiet settled around me like a decision finally kept. For the first time, I slept without rehearsing what I would say in the morning. Because I already knew. The next morning arrived with a strange calm, the kind that only comes after you stop negotiating with yourself. I made coffee, not rushing. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the street wake up. My phone had new messages, but I did not open them. I did not need to read panic to understand what had happened. I had lived inside their patterns for years. I knew the sequence by heart. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at my door. Not gentle, not furious, just firm, repeated twice, as if the person knocking wanted to be let in before pride turned into anger. When I opened the door, Ethan stood on my porch with his shoulders tight and his eyes tired. He looked like a man who had not slept. His hair was slightly out of place, his jaw set in a way that tried to look controlled and failed. For a moment, he looked younger. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to come home from school and drop his backpack in the hallway, expecting dinner to be waiting. Then the adult version returned. "Mom," he said quickly, "we need to talk." I stepped back and let him in, not as a welcome, as a choice. I did not hug him. I did not ask if he was okay. I did not offer a seat right away. I simply closed the door behind him and stood across from him in my living room, leaving space between us that had always existed but had never been named. He started talking immediately, words spilling out in a familiar rhythm. He said the venue was embarrassed. He said Naomi was humiliated. He said Margaret was furious. He said people were confused. He said my granddaughter did not deserve drama. He said I could have handled it privately. He said he did not understand why I would do that to them. He used the word them the way he always did, as if family was a unit I was always outside of. When he finally paused to breathe, I spoke. My voice was quiet, calm. There was no shaking, no raised volume. That was not because I did not feel anything. It was because I was done turning my emotions into a performance. I received your text, I said, the one that told me not to come. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked away for half a second, as if searching for a safer topic. I was already dressed, I continued. I had the gift on the bed, the party I paid for, and you told me I was not wanted. He swallowed. It was complicated, he said. You know how Naomi's mom is. She was making it a thing. I was trying to keep the peace. I nodded once, slowly. You were trying to keep their peace, I said. You were asking me to disappear so they could feel comfortable. He started to protest, but I lifted my hand slightly, not as a threat, just as a boundary. He stopped. I am not angry, I said. I am clear. That sentence landed in the room like a weight. Ethan blinked as if he was waiting for the part where I cried, where I softened, where I gave him an opening to fix this with a half apology and a promise to do better. I did not. I've been paying for things and being treated like an inconvenience, I said. I have been hearing comments. I have been watching you excuse them, and I have been accepting it because I did not want to lose you. His eyes narrowed slightly. So you're punishing us, he said, his voice sharper now, over one text. I looked at him for a long moment. I heard the old fear whisper, the instinct to smooth it over, to reassure him that I was not difficult. Then I let that instinct pass. This is not punishment, I said. This is me stopping. He stared at me. Stopping what? Stopping the version of me you rely on, I replied. The one who will always say yes, then apologize for wanting respect. His face tightened. Mom, he said, and there it was again, the familiar tone, the request before the sentence, the expectation that I would understand. Please, you can't just cut us off. The moral question rose in me like a tide, the deepest one, the one that kept mothers trapped for generations. Was cutting off your child cruelty? Was a boundary the same as abandonment? Was protecting yourself a betrayal of love? I took a slow breath and answered with the smallest truth I could hold. I am not cutting you off, I said. I am cutting off access to my silence. He flinched as if I had struck him, not because the words were loud, but because they were accurate. For a moment, he looked afraid, not me, of consequences, of losing the safety net he had mistaken for love. I love you, I said, still calm. But love does not mean I keep letting you use me. Ethan's eyes filled slightly, and I could see the fight inside him, the part that wanted to blame me, the part that wanted to admit he had gone too far. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I held my posture. I did not lean forward. I did not rescue him from discomfort, because this was the last confrontation. Not the last time we would ever speak, maybe, but the last time I would beg to be treated as human. And he could feel it. And he could feel it. When Ethan finally left, he did not slam the door. He did not apologize either. He walked out the way people do when they are carrying a truth they do not yet know how to hold. I stood in my entryway for a moment after the car pulled away, listening to the quiet return to my house like a tide coming back in. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I walked next door. Helen Brooks lived in the small house beside mine, the one with the tidy porch and the wind chimes that sang softly whenever the air shifted. She was 72, a widow, with eyes that missed nothing and hands that always seemed to be doing something useful. We had waved at each other for months, exchanged polite greetings, and kept our lives separate, the way many neighbors do. But after the confrontation with Ethan, I realized I did not want to sit alone inside my own thoughts, not because I needed comfort, but because I needed perspective. Helen opened her door before I could knock twice. She looked at my face and said, "Come in." No questions, no performance, just an invitation. Her living room smelled faintly of tea and clean linen. A quilt lay folded over the arm of the couch. There were framed photos on a shelf, not arranged to impress, but placed the way people place memories they still respect. Helen poured tea without asking, as if she understood that some things do not need permission. I sat at her small kitchen table, hands wrapped around the warm mug. The silence between us was not awkward. It was the kind of silence that waits for honesty. After a few minutes, Helen said, "Your son was here." I nodded. "He came to talk." Helen watched me carefully. "Did you fold?" The word landed with precision. Not cruel, not judging, just accurate. I swallowed. "No," I said. "Not this time." Helen's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Good," she said simply. I did not know why her approval mattered, but it did. Maybe because it came from a place of lived understanding, not theory. Helen had the kind of posture you earn through surviving things quietly. I told her, in broad strokes, what had happened. The text, the party, the way my money had become assumed. I did not dramatize it. I did not paint myself as a saint. I only told the truth as cleanly as I could. Helen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her mug down and looked at the window for a moment, as if she were watching her own past move across the glass. "My children used to say," she began slowly, "that I was the strong one, the one who could handle anything." She gave a small, dry laugh. That was their favorite compliment, because it meant they never had to worry about what they were taking. I stayed quiet, letting her continue. Helen told me about her husband's illness, the years of hospital visits, the way she kept the home running while working part-time, the way she managed bills that did not add up. She described it with details that made it real. The calendar is filled with appointments. The meals were eaten standing up because there was no time to sit. The checkbook balanced late at night when the house finally slept. When her husband passed, she said, her children stepped into her life like managers stepping into a business. They did not ask how she was grieving. They asked what she planned to do with the life insurance. They asked if she would sell the house. They suggested kindly that she move in with one of them so they could take care of her. I thought it sounded loving, Helen said. I wanted to believe it. I was lonely. I was exhausted, and I had been trained to think that being needed was proof I mattered. Her voice stayed steady, but I could hear the ache underneath it. She told me how she moved in with her oldest daughter, how the guest room became storage, how her mail began to disappear into someone else's hands. She told me how small it felt to ask permission for simple things, a visit with a friend, a purchase, a quiet afternoon alone. She told me about the day she overheard her son on the phone, laughing, saying, "Mom's fine. She'll do what we decide." The sentence sounded too familiar. I did not stop it then, Helen said. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself this was family. I told myself I was lucky they wanted me around. She looked at me, her eyes sharp now. But peace that costs you your dignity is not peace. It is a cage with soft walls. I felt my throat tighten. How did you get out? I asked. Helen's gaze dropped briefly to her hands. Not quickly, she admitted. I had to accept that my children were not confused. They were comfortable, and comfort is hard to disturb. She leaned forward slightly, voice quiet but firm. I stopped paying for things I was not allowed to have a voice in. I moved back here. I changed my paperwork. I made it clear that love would not buy them access to my life. Then she said the sentence that stayed with me long after I went home. I wish I had stopped sooner than you. Her words were not envious. They were grief, offered like a warning. I held my mug and nodded slowly. In that moment, I understood why Daniel's calm authority mattered and why my own silence had finally become power. Helen was not telling me to hate my son. She was showing me what happens when you wait too long to protect yourself. And sitting at her table, I felt something I had not felt in years. No shame, not guilt, solidarity. Solidarity. That was the word I carried back into my house that evening, like something warm tucked inside a coat pocket. Helen had not handed me anger. She had handed me perspective. And once you see your life clearly through someone else's reflection, you cannot unsee it. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not empty, just quieter. The loud urgency that used to pull me toward my phone began to fade, like a radio turned down slowly over time. Ethan sent a few messages that tried to sound reasonable. Naomi sent none. Margaret, thankfully, stayed silent. Daniel handled what needed to be handled. Accounts were reviewed, automatic payments were stopped, documents were organized in a folder I kept in my kitchen drawer, within reach, not hidden away in fear. And then, with the chaos contained, I began to notice something I had forgotten. Time. I started waking up without dread. I made my tea and actually sat down to drink it while it was still hot. For years, my tea had always been reheated, microwaved, sipped in between tasks. Now I let the steam rise and did not rush it. I watched the surface ripple when I stirred. I listened to the quiet of my own kitchen, the small familiar sounds that used to be drowned out by obligation. One morning, I opened the drawer and took out the old silk scarf, pale green, frayed at the edges, soft from age. I ran it through my fingers slowly. It had belonged to my mother. She wore it on days she wanted to feel composed, even when life was heavy. When she died, I kept it not as an heirloom to display, but as a reminder that dignity can be simple, a small act of care, a gentle ritual. I tied it loosely around my neck and looked at myself in the mirror, not to check if I looked younger, only to recognize the woman standing there. I began living slower on purpose. I took walks in the afternoon, not for exercise, but for air. I bought groceries without calculating what I might also need to pick up for someone else. I cooked meals I liked. I played music softly while I cleaned, not because I had to, but because I wanted the house to feel lived in, not managed. It surprised me how quickly my body responded to peace. My shoulders softened. My sleep deepened. The constant tightness in my jaw eased. I realized I had been holding my breath for years, as if one wrong move would cause something to collapse. Then I did something that might sound small but felt like a turning point. I began volunteering. There was a local community center not far from my neighborhood, a place that served meals and helped older women find resources after divorce, after loss, after quiet years of being overlooked. I signed up to help twice a week. No grand announcement, no dramatic reason. I simply showed up. I set tables. I poured coffee. I listened. The women there did not ask me what I owned or what I could pay for. They asked me where I was from. They asked me what I used to love doing. They asked me what made me laugh. Some of them carried stories that felt painfully familiar. A daughter who only called when rent was due. A son who used guilt like a leash. A marriage that had trained them to disappear. I did not lecture them. I did not tell them what they should do. I just sat with them in the truth of their lives, the way Helen had sat with me. And slowly, I felt something inside me heal in a quiet, steady way. It was not that my family pain vanished. It did not. There were moments when I still reached for my phone out of habit, still felt a pull when I saw a child's birthday card in a store, still wondered if my granddaughter missed me. But the difference was this. Those feelings no longer controlled my choices. I could miss them and still protect myself. I could love them and still say no. One evening, I came home from the community center, made tea, and stood in my kitchen with the scarf resting lightly against my collarbone. The room was warm. The light above the stove cast a soft glow on the counters. Nothing dramatic was happening. No confrontation, no apology, no revenge. Just peace. I realized then that quiet justice does not always look like someone getting what they deserve. Sometimes it looks like you are finally giving yourself what you needed all along. Time, respect, a life that belongs to you. I took a sip of tea and let it be hot. I let it be enough. I took a sip of tea and let it be hot. I let it be enough. And in that quiet, I finally understood something I used to fear. Peace is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-respect. For weeks after everything happened, I kept waiting for the dramatic aftermath people always promise when you draw a line. I expected a storm, a public scene, a family meeting, a guilt-filled speech about how I was breaking everyone's heart. But what actually came was smaller and in some ways harder. What came was space. Messages that arrived and did not control my breathing, invitations that did not show up. Silence that used to feel like punishment now felt like permission. Ethan reached out twice with a careful tone, the way someone tests a surface they once assumed was unbreakable. The first message was long, full of explanations, full of reasons, stress, pressure, Naomi's mother, the embarrassment of the party, the misunderstanding. The second message was shorter. It asked if I was okay. I did not respond right away. I let the question sit, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted my answer to come from the woman I had become, not the woman I used to perform. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. I told him I was safe. I told him I needed time. I told him I loved him. And then I stopped there. I did not add a paragraph of reassurance. I did not volunteer my money, my effort, my emotional labor as proof of forgiveness. I did not negotiate my own dignity to keep him comfortable. That was the new boundary, quiet but firm. Love without access, care without surrender. Naomi did not contact me. Margaret did not either, and in a strange way, their silence clarified everything. For years, I had wondered if I was being overly sensitive, if I was misreading them, if I was unfair for wanting basic respect. Their absence answered the question. They were not confused. They were inconvenienced. And I no longer needed to convince them of my worth. I also did not seek revenge. I did not call relatives to tell my side. I did not post anything online. I did not try to humiliate anyone the way I had been humiliated. I refused to become a mirror of the cruelty that had been offered to me. Quiet justice is not about making someone else suffer. It is about ending the pattern that makes you suffer. It is about removing your life from the hands of people who treat it like a resource. The hardest part was accepting that there might never be a clean apology. Not the kind I imagined late at night, where Ethan would sit across from me and finally say, "Mom, I see what I did. I see what it cost you. I am sorry. I still hope for that moment because mothers do. But hope is different now. Hope is no longer a contract that requires me to keep giving. It is simply a wish, held softly, without letting it dictate my choices." There were days when grief surprised me in ordinary places. I would pass a children's section at the store and think of my granddaughter's laugh. I would see a family in a restaurant and feel the old ache rise in my chest. I would come home from volunteering and remember how often I used to pour myself into people who never asked how I was doing. The grief was real. I did not deny it. I just stopped letting it rewrite the truth. I began to build a life that did not depend on being chosen by people who benefited from my disappearance. At the community center, I met women who had been called selfish for wanting rest, women who had been told they were dramatic for wanting respect, women who were slowly learning that boundaries are not cruel. They are clarity. I listened to them, and in their stories, I heard echoes of my own. Generational trauma does not always look like shouting or violence. Sometimes it looks like a daughter learning to swallow her feelings because her mother did. Sometimes it looks like a son learning that a woman's love is automatic and therefore disposable. Healing begins when someone finally says, "This stops with me." One evening, Helen came over with a small plate of cookies and sat at my kitchen table. We did not talk about Ethan. We talked about gardens, about weather, about the strange relief of not being needed by people who do not see you. Before she left, she touched the silk scarf draped over the back of my chair and said, "Your mother would be proud." I did not answer right away. I just nodded, because the words filled my throat. After she left, I stood alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once reheated dinners for people who never noticed the effort. The light was warm, the counters were clean, my tea kettle sat quietly on the stove, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Ownership, not of a house, but of myself. I realized I had spent decades being the foundation, the invisible structure holding everyone else's comfort. I had believed that if I stayed steady, if I stayed generous, if I stayed easy to use, I would be loved in return. But love that requires you to be small is not love. It is convenient. And I was no longer available for convenience. I was not asking my family to worship me. I was not demanding gratitude. I was simply refusing to participate in my own erasure. That is what my boundary was. That is what my silence meant. It was not punishment. It was protection. It was the calm decision to stop explaining my humanity to people who benefited from ignoring it. I used to think sacrifice was the highest form of motherhood. Now I believe something different. Boundaries are the last form of love. Not because they cut people out, but because they tell the truth. They say, I will not let you harm me, and call it family. They say, you can love me, but you cannot use me. They say, if you want me in your life, you will have to meet me with respect, and if you cannot, I will still survive. I will still live. I will still heal. I will still begin again. I was the foundation. Now I am at the home I live in. I was the foundation, but no one looks at a foundation with gratitude. Now I am the home I live in, and I will not hand over the keys to anyone who treats me like an afterthought. I once said I was the foundation, but no one sees the foundation. Now I see myself clearly, and that is the beginning of freedom. I used to be the foundation. Now I am the home of my own life. If you have made it this far, I want to ask you something, gently and honestly. If you were me, would you have done what I did? And have you ever been the person everyone forgot, even after you gave them everything?